Okay, so let's look at some behavioral asymmetry in the intact brain. So researchers have designed some clever experiments to test the different types of processing of the two hemispheres in people with intact brains. So these are non-invasive studies of intact brains, and the results of these studies mostly do confirm the results from these studies with neurological patients, split brain patients. So usually these tasks are in the visual domain, where comparisons are made between the presentation of stimuli to the left or right visual field. And this would be using equipment that can project information to the left or right visual field in isolation. With the intact brain, though, of course, no matter how much care is taken to present information to one hemisphere only, and even if it is done very rapidly, the potential for transfer between the hemispheres is, high, right? So even so, there are some consistent differences that have been found depending on which visual field is stimulated. And also, we can look at this in the auditory domain as well. So let's just have a quick look. Okay, so we've got one technique to deliver stimuli in such a way that it only reaches one hemisphere, at least for the most part, and then we can kind of look at how one hemisphere over the other manages to process these stimuli on its own. In this case, what we have, we've got a fixation point. We've got some projected images, words, and phrases onto the screen in front of the person. So these studies, this study was done by Michael Ganzangia. He found that, by flashing items quickly enough, that basically the subject's eyes had no time to move. He was able to kind of present information to just one hemisphere at a time. So information projected to the subject's left visual field was received by the right hemisphere when done quickly enough, and information projected to the right visual field would be received by the left. So he found that certain types of information were processed better by the right hemisphere. So visual spatial information like pictures, picture of a phone, picture of a dog, would be processed better by the right hemisphere. So behavioral asymmetry in the intact brain is often done through the through the auditory system. So the auditory system also attempt to isolate input to one hemisphere. And as is the case with vision, the stimuli can be presented to one ear or the other. So it can be presented in such a way that it's restricted to one ear. And the auditory system, it's only partially crossed, meaning that the left hemisphere processes the majority of the information that is presented to the right ear, whereas the right hemisphere processes a smaller portion of this auditory input and vice versa. So because the auditory pathways are not strictly lateralized as much as the visual pathways, auditory information is projected bilaterally to some extent, but most auditory information is projects contralaterally to the other side. So the predominant and fastest input to the auditory cortex does come from the contralateral ear. So, so with so let's just look at this. So we've got our cochlea on each side. We've got our cochlear nucleus here, which is kind of the next stop along the auditory pathway after the cochlea. So most of those ascending fibers from the cochlear nucleus do project to the contralateral side, as you can see here, represented by those red lines. And then the ipsilateral projections are indicated with those dotted lines. So as you can see, most of the information does project to the contralateral side. There is some to the ipsilateral side, as it travels up from the cochlear nucleus to the thalamus. But the predominant and fastest input to the auditory cortex does come from the contralateral ear, which is indicated by these thick red lines. Okay, so we've got this task. It's called a dichotic listening task. And this is a task that is used for a variety of research purposes, attention, things like that. Looking at, whether or not we, studies of divided attention, for example, would use this dichotic listening task of presenting kind of one thing to each ear or simultaneously to each ear. So the dichotic listening task, we've got two competing messages that are presented to each ear at the same time. And the task is to report both messages. So we've got the dichotic listening task, taking advantage of the fact that most of the auditory input to the right ear is relayed to the opposite auditory cortex and vice versa. So this means different auditory stimuli can be presented simultaneously to both ears through headphones, and the participant can then be asked to report what they heard. So most research looking at using this task has shown a small but consistent right ear advantage for language material. So people are better able to, so if we look here, we've got our person doing their dichotic listening task. So they're having these words presented to their right ear, which is going to be sent to their left hemisphere. And we've got these words being presented to their left ear, which is going to be sent to their right hemisphere. So which ones would you imagine that they are better at reporting? Well, you can imagine that we're talking about language here, so probably going to be better at reporting the ones that are being sent to the left hemisphere. So let's see what we've got being sent to the left hemisphere. Cat, table, rose. What do we got? Table, nose, race car. So, words being presented to the right ear, going to the left hemisphere, ball, race car, nose. So we've got race car, yes. We've got nose, yes. We've got ball, yes. We've got one word that made it to the right hemisphere getting reported. So more words being reported from the right hemisphere, which would of course be going to the right ear, which would be going to the left hemisphere. So basically, language, again, processed better in the left hemisphere. So language stimuli presented to the right ear remembered better compared to being presented to the left ear. So, what about, what is the right hemisphere good at detecting? Well, it turns out faces and visuospatial information are processed better by the right hemisphere. And, if words presented to the right ear are better remembered because they are processed by the left hemisphere, well, this isn't the case for all. It's not just because it's a sound, it's language in particular, because if melodies are presented to the left hemisphere and being processed by the being presented to the left ear and then processed by the right hemisphere, melodies are more memorable than those if they're presented to the right ear. So a right hemisphere advantage for melodies and visual spatial information. So yes, language processed better by the left hemisphere, faces and visual spatial information processed better by the right hemisphere, including melodies. So we also have some asymmetry in the motor system between the left and right hemispheres. So, for one, damage to the left hemisphere, the motor regions in the left hemisphere, can result in a neurological condition called apraxia, which is a loss of skilled fine movements. So so let's skip that for a minute, and let's look at some more asymmetry in the motor system in terms of spontaneous versus facial expressions. So there does appear to be a difference in each hemisphere's ability to produce voluntary facial expressions. So both hemispheres can produce spontaneous facial expressions, but it appears that the left hemisphere is important for producing voluntary facial expressions. So it seems that we have kind of two neural systems involved in controlling facial expressions. So let's look at this. So when a split brain patient, when their left hemisphere is given the command to smile, so they're asked to smile, what happens is that the lower right side of their face responds first, and the left side will end up responding, some milliseconds later. So basically what we've got here in a voluntary facial response, we've got a couple of pathways here. So we've got the voluntary pathways kind of laid out in the broken lines, and then we'll have the spontaneous ones in the pathways that are important for spontaneous facial expressions in the solid lines. So let's look. So this is for a voluntary facial expression. So we've got motor cortex involved here. For spontaneous facial expressions, so they are able, split brain patients are able to do this. So it appears that unlike voluntary facial expressions, which only the left hemisphere is capable of triggering, spontaneous expressions can be kind of managed by either side of the brain. So when either side of the brain triggers a spontaneous response, each hemisphere sends signals straight down through the midbrain, and out the brainstem to the cranial nerves of the face. So spontaneous facial expressions not affected by split brain in split brain patients because it appears, I guess, that these pathways controlling spontaneous facial expressions are more based on a kind of a primitive, older spontaneous expressions involving older brain circuits, not the cortex, which, of course, in the case of a split brain injury, cortex would be severed, whereas these non-cortical regions would be still intact. So the kind of neural networks for spontaneous facial expressions involving some of these older, evolutionarily older circuits. So we do have asymmetry in the somatosensory system. And with the somatosensory system, the input is almost completely crossed. So the left hand projects to the right hemisphere. So for example, the sensory motor strip of, say, the parietal lobe of the left hemisphere, that's going to process objects placed in the right hand. So the somatosensory inputs are completely crossed because those neural tracts project only to one hemisphere, opposite the body site of the stimulation. And in terms of how this kind of translates into function, there's been research showing that there's a left hand advantage for reading Braille. Certainly, further kind of supporting the specialization of the right hemisphere in visuospatial tasks. So Braille reading being, requiring you to recognize patterns, understand those patterns, of course, being more of a visual spatial task. And if we're doing it with our left hand, it means that the right hemisphere would be processing that. And also other examples of kind of laterality in the somatosensory system, if you're talking about recognizing objects by touch. So left hand advantage for recognizing shapes, which of course, if we're doing it with our left hand, it's going to be the right hemisphere. So we've got a right hemisphere advantage for recognizing shapes through touch. And a right hand, which means a left hemisphere advantage for recognizing letters. So more with kind of the visuospatial linguistic division. So let's just we can kind of sum this up, in terms of broad categories of functions and which are kind of more associated with one hemisphere versus the other. So here's our list of general functions. So we've got vision, auditory, touch, movement, memory, language, spatial abilities. So in the visual domain, it appears, if you're talking about anything words or language related, left hemisphere dominance for that. Recognizing words and letters through vision. For the right hemisphere, recognizing visual spatial objects like faces, geometric patterns, emotional expressions. Right hemisphere advantage for that. The auditory system, language sounds again for the left hemisphere. And then we've got non-language sounds, music, melodies, things like that, getting a right hemisphere advantage. In terms of touch, recognizing patterns through the tactile, through tactile perception, things like Braille. When we're looking at movement, complex, precise movements, getting a left, particularly those involving one side, the ipsilateral side. Involving the left hemisphere, movement and spatial patterns, getting a right hemisphere advantage. Memory. We didn't talk too much about memory in this class, but you can imagine verbal memory is getting a left hemisphere advantage, whereas nonverbal, more perceptual aspects of memory getting a right hemisphere advantage. Language. As you can see, big left hemisphere advantage here, whether it's speaking, reading, writing, doing math, all these types of language functions, getting a left hemisphere advantage. Emotional content of language, getting that right hemisphere advantage. And then for spatial abilities, mental rotation of shapes, geometry, directions, determining distance, all those kind of spatial tasks, kind of getting the same treatment on the right side as language functions get on the left side. So each hemisphere contributes to different aspects of a general function. So as you can see, it's not so much about one hemisphere being dominant in all regards. It just ends up being that the left versus right hemisphere, each one is contributing more contributing particular functions, particular aspects of these general functions. So at the end of the day, and despite a lot of research on this, more than 40 years of research into split brain patient studies and laterality studies in intact individuals, we still have to exercise some caution when drawing conclusion from these studies about laterality, especially with the split brain patients, because we have to remember that the brains of these individuals, they were not normal to begin with. So they had epilepsy, severe epilepsy, and that's likely to impact their brain functioning above and beyond the commissurectomy, the separation of the corpus callosum. So they are really, these split brain patients, they are atypical non-random sample, atypical non-random sample of cases. So we have to keep that in mind. And also, many of the studies that we've looked at are an indirect measure of brain function, right? So we're only talking about, a correlation between, say, remembering words that are presented to one hemisphere or the other. So we're only looking at a correlation between basically hemisphere that it's presented to and how many words you can remember, right? So we're looking at a correlation between those two things. So this isn't going to ultimately be an indirect measure. And also, results are going to be subject to interpretation. Because when we're talking about case studies, there's always the issue of bias on the part of the researchers. You're dealing with a small number of people being studied very extensively, often by the same researchers. There's always the risk for bias, interpretation of those results. And also, some of the laterality effects, in particular dichotic listening tasks, these effects can will disappear if you tell the person to focus on the information presented to the left ear, which is going to the right hemisphere. So like I said, with these dichotic listening tasks, they are often used to study selective attention too. And one of the ways that this is done is, by seeing if people can ignore the signal being sent to one ear or the other. And it turns out people can do this. So if you simply tell the person, pay particular attention to what's being presented to the left ear, then we would have those results flipped, right? Where they'd be remembering more words presented to the left ear, and as a result, being processed by the right hemisphere. So some of these laterality effects will disappear simply by changing the instruction and getting the person to focus their attention on the left ear. So this brings us to another kind of interesting topic when you're talking about laterality, and whether or not we have individual differences in our preferred cognitive mode. And certainly we do have, different people have different ways that they like to receive and process information. And I think in your textbook, they give you an example of, two different professors. We've got Professor Alpha and Professor Beta. One is analytical and detailed. The other is more of a holistic, big picture thinker. and both professors successful, but they approach problems in different ways. So that is certainly the case with many people. So we do have individual differences in kind of our thinking style that and individual differences can cause people to use one type of thought process instead of another. So some people prefer logic and math, others prefer looking at the big picture, right? So and sometimes these people might be grouped into being left-brained if you prefer logic and math, right-brained if you prefer looking at the big picture. And it's certainly possible that factors other than lateralization of brain functions can influence, whichever cognitive mode that we prefer to use. And certainly, whatever cognitive mode that we prefer to use can bias how we approach problems. And certainly, this can potentially influence the results of some of these tests of lateralization. So we potentially have different processing styles, and really you can think about these processing styles as perhaps these functional differences between the hemispheres being not so much about what they're processing, so language versus visual spatial, so maybe not so much what they're processing, but how it's being processed. So perhaps the left hemisphere is specialized to process information in kind of an analytical sequential way, whereas the right hemisphere adopts a more holistic parallel type of processing. But again, it's perhaps less about what each hemisphere is processing and perhaps more about how each hemisphere processes the same types of information. So what about asymmetry? And this is going to be just kind of briefly before we wrap up. Asymmetry in other species, and non-human primates in particular. Well, asymmetry, not just something that's found in human brains, it's indeed found throughout the animal kingdom. So songbirds, chickens, rodents, cats, and primates, including the human and non-human variety of primates, all show some evidence of functional asymmetry. So, for example, songbirds. Songbirds, a lot of research done on this topic has shown pretty convincingly that song production in many songbirds, like canaries, for example, depends on left brain structures, and song production can be disrupted by lesions to the left hemisphere, but not lesions to the right hemisphere. So many birds, but not all, do show this left hemisphere specialization for song production. So like I said, many, not all. Not the case with all birds. Other animals, chickens actually, they have a right foot preference when they are scratching the ground and looking for food. Cats too may show a preferential paw that they prefer to use when they're reaching for food. Frogs and salamanders, the vocalizations that they produce, left lateralized. Frogs and salamanders. Bees also show some lateralization in terms of learning odors, um, that are associated with reward, and also remembering these associations. Um, so certainly in many other animals, we see lateralization. And in other primates, so non-human primates like chimpanzees, they have asymmetries in some of the language regions that humans do. So these are considered homologs, um, meaning that they are in about the right location for something like Broca's area or the planum temporale in humans. So chimpanzees, although they don't use spoken language, obviously they don't have the correct vocal apparatus to produce speech the way that humans can, but nevertheless they do show asymmetries in the non-human primate homologue of Broca's area and the planum temporale. So again, these asymmetries mimicking what we see in humans. And also, in primates and not non-human primates, they do show some preference for using one particular hand, um, but not showing predominantly right-handedness like humans do, um, necessarily. Um, some monkeys though are better able to like rhesus monkeys for example, better able to make tactile discriminations with their left hand compared to their right hand, whereas fine motor skills perform better with their right hand than their left. Again, if you're talking about fine pattern discrimination being better with your left hand and hence your right hemisphere with all those spatial abilities. This is similar to what I was just talking about with the Braille reading, right? So that would be a fine pattern discrimination that you'd be doing tactilely. So humans are better at doing that with their left hand and hence their right hemisphere. Same thing with rhesus monkeys. They're better able to make those tactile discriminations with their left compared to their right hand. In sum, basically, to sum it up, we've got both functional and structural asymmetries that are apparent in other species in addition to humans. Perhaps less consistent, perhaps less pronounced than humans, but certainly there. Okay, so that wraps up our Nearpod lesson for chapter 11.